evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Emma, and on behalf of everyone at Better Ed Than Dead, we're really excited to see you all on Zoom to celebrate The Ethical Omnivore by Laura Dalrymple and Grant Hilliard. Tonight, Laura and Grant are in conversation with Charlotte Wood. The event tonight is being recorded, so if you don't want to be filmed, just turn off your camera, and you'll notice that you've been muted just for the purpose of eliminating any background noise. Before we begin the proceedings, I just want to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. These will be different lands depending on where you're zooming in from. For me, it's the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It is upon their ancestral lands that Better Ed Than Dead is built. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that this was and always will be Aboriginal land. Laura Dalrymple and Grant Hilliard run Feather and Bone Providores in Sydney, renowned for its emphasis on regenerative farming and transparency in meat production. I myself grew up going to Feather and Bone every Saturday morning, and Laura and Grant have broadened the palates and minds of many families such as mine with their ethical approach to eating meat. Laura and Grant are recognisable faces throughout the inner west, and last year we hosted Laura when she conducted an in-conversation with the author and farmer Matthew Evans. Charlotte is one of Australia's most acclaimed and original writers. Her best-selling novel, The Natural Way of Things, won the 2016 Stella Prize, and her most recent release, The Weekend, was longlisted for the Miles Franklin Award this year. We're very thrilled that she has joined us tonight to lead the in-conversation with Laura and Grant. There'll be a Q&A session towards the end. If you have any questions for Laura and Grant, you can type them into the chat box, which you can see on your right-hand side, and they'll be read out. And they'll be answered by video time when the time comes. There'll also be a recording of this that you can get from us after, so if you have to leave early or you know someone that's missed it tonight, get in touch and we can send them a Dropbox file. And without further ado, here's Charlotte to kick things off.
Thank you so much, Emma, and thank you everyone for coming along tonight. I am really excited to welcome you to this conversation with two very special people, Laura and Grant, Laura Dalrymple and Grant Hilliard, as you've heard. So it's kind of ironic that we're all here on Zoom again, feeling maybe a little alienated and a little disconnected from each other and from normal life. I don't know if we have anyone from Victoria here, but we send you lots of love. You know, we're very disconnected right now from what we would think of as the natural state of things. And that is ironic because The Ethical Omnivore, this book, I'll be doing this a bit, is about the opposite of that. This book for me is about connection of the farmers to the soil and the land, of butchers to the farmers, of we consumers to the people who grow and raise and make our food and those who bring it to us, and also connection of all of us to each other. It's about community and it's about hope. I read an early copy of this book in the middle of the bushfires in January when I had never been so depressed or distraught about our natural world and what we've done to it. And this book, The Ethical Omnivore, was the only thing I read really still that gave me hope about our country. That gave me the sense that there was any possibility of change in the way that we have managed our natural spaces and the future of our communities. I absolutely love this book, and for all of those reasons, and of course for the amazing recipes. Disclaimer, I have one recipe in there, but it's probably the most boring in the whole book. I'm going to stop talking about myself very soon. But I just want to explain why I, a novelist, am interviewing two butchers. I met Grant and Laura when I, years and years ago, went to Feather and Bone to buy a Christmas ham because somebody had told me that they sold amazing, delicious Christmas hams. And that was very, very true and still is very true. But at that point, I really had, you know, not really any real interest in the ethical issues around eating meat, about raising meat, or the ethics of how we produce our food in general, and how that food gets to us then. But very slowly, through shopping with them over time, through Laura's fantastic newsletters and just going in and buying and chatting, I was drawn into an awareness of these things. And I began to, in small ways, just start to change the way that I shop and that I eat. And it added a really important dimension to my life, I have to say, a really pleasurable dimension. It's not a sort of guilt thing. It's not a sort of stressy thing. It's just understanding about how complex it is to get that, you know, potato or chop to your table. It's been really fascinating to me. And although I'm still learning and growing and trying and often failing to lighten my own footprint on the earth and on our systems, and trying to support businesses that add more to the land than they take from it. I know that buying food from Grant and Laura and being in conversation with them over many years has really changed my life for the better. And I just want to say thank you for that, you guys.
Oh, that's gorgeous.
So we've decided that for this conversation, we're not going to move sort of meticulously through the book because there's so much in there. And I know many of you have bought the book, and if you haven't, I really urge you to do so because it is a beautiful thing. So we thought we'd range around in a really kind of natural conversation, we hope, as natural as Zoom allows. And we luckily know each other well enough to interrupt and tell each other to shut up and backtrack and so on. But hopefully there'll be some direction and shape because I'm the boss. So I get to say shut up more than anybody. Now, I'm going to start by asking a burning question that I have had about this time now that we're facing. And then I'm going to flip my computer off the thing. Okay. And then I'm going to backtrack to the beginning of Feather and Bone and how you guys got into that. So first of all, I think maybe Grant is best placed to answer this. I want to know why around the world right now, meat packing plants and abattoirs seem to be hotspots for coronavirus outbreaks. It sounds really creepy and it's disturbing. And I don't think it's because the virus is in the meat, right? So why meat packing plants rather than blueberry plants or car manufacturers?
Because the people who work in those places are lined up in the chain that the animals are disassembled on. You can't really alter that very easily without really building a whole new chain. So each group of workers works side by side in quite close proximity, and the whole process of breaking down, you know, which are when you're talking with cattle, are really large animals. That they're working very closely together, and you can't separate that without changing the speed or the pacing of the chain, and also where each of the sort of activities happens. And often they require particular equipment that is dedicated to that spot. So, you know, you sort of, it's quite unnerving the first time you see a large cow split down the middle by basically a chainsaw. And the guy that does that is on a small platform, a foot operated platform that rises and falls about 3 or 4 meters. So he starts at the top and then pulls this electric chainsaw down through the center of the body and down straight through the middle of the spine. Now, obviously that can only happen in that one place, and you can't really change the structure of that, where for sort of things like blueberry packing or other sorts of processes, the people can be spread out more. You can change the way that the setup works. So I think that's the reason. They're asking them to reduce, as I understand it in Victoria, they're asking them to reduce their output by 1/3. So I think that means 2/3 of the numbers of workers on the chain at any one time, which will give them more spacing. So I suppose that's the reason.
Right. So it's a highly mechanized sort of.
It's highly physical, but it's the positioning is dictated by the mechanics and the chain as it's built. Yes.
Right.
Always like that though.
Sorry?
Not always like that. I mean, some of the farmers we work with, they're unusual in that they have on-farm abattoirs.
Yes, and I want to come back to that, Laura, because this whole thing about short chains, or I get the language wrong, but you can tell me. But yeah, local small operators is becoming really clear, the importance of that now, isn't it? Okay, sorry to interrupt you there, Laura. Look, let's go back to the beginning then of Feather and Bone, because you two are very unlikely butchers, right? Grant, you started out working in film and then you were a sommelier. And Laura, you were a graphic designer. So how did two people from really immersed in the creative arts come to be butchers?
That's really Grant's story, because he started Feather and Bone. I joined, you know, the rollicking ride a little bit later, but Grant started it. So I think he should answer that question.
From working in restaurants, Charlotte. So, as you said, I was a sommelier in restaurants, and I used to source wine and visit vineyards. And that anyone who visits a vineyard, you get a sense of how it's produced, and that's sort of really critical to being able to tell that story about the wine to the customers you're selling it to, but it also locates it really specifically. And in wine, there's sort of no, there's no qualms about talking about location as being important to the quality of the wine. I sort of wanted to extend that to the meat that we were buying, and it was more of a curiosity too about being able to source rare breeds of lamb, and sheep were at that stage basically undifferentiated in what we bought in the restaurant, where everything else was really quite highly differentiated, and
Right.
and that level of differentiation was valued, but with lamb it certainly wasn't. And I knew that there was about 300 varieties of lamb in the world, or breeds of lamb, and it's strange that they're never, you know, despite the 300 breeds, they're never referred to unless they're merinos and it's in the wool trade, which is really quite specific. But for meat breeds, people in the trade knew a bit, but it was rarely sort of celebrated or remarked upon in the restaurants where I was working anyway. So I sort of was interested in that, and it was a curiosity to see whether older breeds of lamb were any better. I mean, maybe the newer breeds were better for good reason.
So did you start, you know, buying animals yourself, like to eat at home, or did you?
Well, I didn't. See, I thought that I would just sell whole animals to restaurants.
Right.
And so I wasn't actually going to break them up. All I had to do was source them, which was not, that makes it sound very simple. It was actually a bit harder than that, but I had to source them and then manage the logistics of the cold chain logistics and get them to a restaurant. And then they could deal with them. But as it soon became sort of very apparent, restaurants, really, it's a very small market when you're selling whole lambs to restaurants. There's only a handful that will take them. And, you know, pretty soon someone says, well, actually, I'd really like just the legs. And then I would sort of prevail on the person who had the cool room I was using to cut the legs off for me. And it went.
My computer just died. I have to turn you. I'm sorry.
Oh, hello.
These guys actually are in the same house. But
You noticed
really,
that I suddenly disappeared?
I'm sorry, Laura, we didn't notice. Sit down. It's nice to
Sorry.
see you both.
Hello, I beg your
That's
pardon.
good. No,
My
it's
computer
good.
just went completely black. So where were you? Continue.
That
Yeah,
you were at how you had started you selling whole animals.
Oh, that's right. So I had to learn how to break them, basically. And at first, the place where I was renting space would break them for me. And then he sort of decided that he was a bit tired of me dabbling, and that if I was going to do this thing, that, you know, I'd have to do it. And he didn't really give me any help from then on. And so it was 3 difficult years learning how to deal with the carcasses that I was buying.
Right. And actually, it's better with you today. I don't know why I told you not to do that before. So
Disconcerting.
you, Laura, at this point were working in design. So what made you then go, all right, I'm going to hop on board the butcher train?
So, well, our lives got very complicated because I was working in a job which was required a lot of time. I was working really long hours. Grant was supposedly trying very hard to be the primary carer of our 3 children.
Supposedly, thank you.
No, but you were stretched between,
Yes,
I mean, you were
that's
working
true.
at night at Sean's, you were trying to do Feather and Bone,
Yeah.
you know, you were trying to deal with the kids, and I was at work, and
Yeah.
we had a nanny, a part-time nanny, and it was all getting a bit intense. And there was one day I remember when I went to drop the kids off, one of our kids at school, and discovered that his entire class was off on an excursion that we didn't know about. So I had a crisis of conscience about my, lack of maternal ability. And I decided, and Grant, I looked at what Grant was doing and I thought, that's really cool. And that what he's doing has such an authentic sort of ethical foundation to it. And it really resonated with me. And I guess I'd spent a lot of time thinking that if I worked consulting to corporates and I worked inside the tent, that was how you really changed things. But I'd become increasingly disillusioned and feeling increasingly sort of discombobulated. The way I felt and my politics and my belief system seemed to be more and more, I was polarized from what I was actually dealing with every day. So I looked at what he was doing and I thought, okay, I'll take some time out. I'll take long service leave. I'll help him set this business up. I'll spend some time with my children and try to feel like, not such a lousy mother. And I never went back, because what I discovered was that running a small business at that stage anyway, and the process of being involved in something that you really care about and believe in, is intoxicating. And I got really sort of caught up in it. And Grant was also selling these wonderful animals that he'd discovered and talking about these amazing relationships, these amazing farmers he'd met. And people in restaurants were starting to say, well, how do I get this at home? And so that sparked the retail business, the retail side of the business, which I sort of started. So,
and which is where I came across you.
Yeah.
I'm conscious of getting
Sorry,
through. No, it's not you. So let's talk about, we'll get down to the book. So people might expect a pair of butchers to write a book which is a defense of meat eating and saying why there's nothing wrong with it. But I don't think that's what this book is. I see it, I guess, as about three things: environmental welfare, animal welfare, and human welfare, and the interdependence of all of those things, right? So let's start with the soil, because when people say to me, oh, they come to dinner and they have this beautiful meat and they go, oh my God, where'd you get this? And I say, from you guys. And they say, oh, they're the people who are all about ethical treatment of animals. And I go, yes, well, yes, they are. But actually my real reason for buying this meat is about soil. And one of your farmers, Rob Lennon, who farms beef at Gundui Organics, he says in the book...
Tonight, actually, Charlotte.
Oh, really?
He might
Fantastic. Well, hello, Rob. You're amazing. So Rob says in the book, I'm a microbe farmer. I don't grow beef, I grow soil. What does he mean?
Well, it's the farmers that we work with understand that the biomass they're responsible for, the thing that they sell is actually a very small part of that. It's the saleable item that makes the farm a business. But in terms of their management, they're managing much more life than they're selling. There's much more life underneath the ground than there is above it. And well, there is on good farms. On poor farms, there's very little life under the soil, under the ground, and in the soil, and that's the whole issue. So most farming in Australia is conducted with the idea that the declining fertility plane of a farm can be counteracted through the application of expensive inputs, and that's obviously expensive, but it's also a sure way. That is an unsustainable model. If you're getting less and less out of your farm than you're putting in, then it won't be long before you're broke. And a lot of farmers find themselves in that position, and they find themselves confronting the harsh reality of how do it's blood from a stone, because once you turn your soil into dirt, then all of a sudden your productive capacity is dramatically reduced. So the farmers we work with are absolutely focused on maintaining productive capacity and the fertility of the soil. The outcropping or the consequence of maintaining that are incredibly healthy lambs or healthy cattle or whatever it might be. So you're right in that you sort of look after animals by default. By looking after the soil, you look after animals anyway. Obviously, there are things that you can do as a farmer in terms of sort of low stress stock handling and things like this that minimize stress on animals and there's the whole aspect of slaughter as well. But in terms of the actual day-to-day management, they're happy if they can get what they can eat, a vast variety, a diversity of pasture in a farm, and they'll stay healthy as a result of that because they have the ability to select what they need.
And your farmers are often not using quite big portions of their land, right? They're not
at any one time.
Yeah.
Yes.
Tell me about that.
Well, you know, it's a very interesting idea that it's hard to get your head around the idea that a farmer could actually take large swathes of land out of production and yet be more productive and produce, you know, turn off an animal or a crop, for example, that is actually more nutrient dense and of a better quality and therefore more valuable in the marketplace than otherwise, because the conventional wisdom is it's all about you know, area. So, you know, growth has to be about having more land and more animals and more scale and so on. And in fact, you know, the farmers we work with and the principles of regenerative farming are very much about sort of tipping that idea on its head and saying, no, it's actually more about creating greater vitality from what you have. And that in itself creates abundance and fertility, which is what Grant was talking about with the soil. So if you're growing topsoil, in fact, if you're managing your soils in a way that creates humus and builds topsoil, then in fact you're actually creating greater capacity. You're not extending your land mass across area, but you are creating a denser capacity for productivity. It's a very interesting idea, and I guess a lot of it sort of links in with environmental management principles around, you know, reforesting, you know, replanting. So the farmers we work with have plant lots and lots and lots of trees, you know, and lots of corridors for wildlife, and they have really abundant, interesting sort of ecologies on their farms.
Well, speaking of that, you have to tell everyone about my favourite guy, Vince Heffernan. I'm obsessed with this picture in the book.
Beautiful story.
Yeah. Tell us about Vince and his fish sanctuary.
The southern pygmy perch. You can tell.
No, go on. You talk about the fish, but I was to preface that, Vince's farm is a good example, and he's taken, you know, areas of his farm out of production, and
he's a 6th generation lamb farmer, right? Sheep farmer.
Yeah, from north of Canberra in the southern tablelands, and he has a huge replanting from locally collected seeds, and so there's a range of shrubs and trees that have been replanted, which provide not just corridors but actual habitat for animals, and that gives you sort of a bleed of fertility. They produce fertility themselves, and the land that's next to it actually gets the fertility bump as well. The other key thing about this is not just sort of fertility, it's carbon. You're actively storing carbon in the soil.
And water.
Which then allows you to manage your water cycle. And most farmers are not able to do that because they have no carbon levels left in their soil. And so they can't manage the water cycle, and it becomes... It's an engine of destruction. What you're looking for is an engine of growth, and you can put the elements in place that allow that to happen, and really quite quickly. So this sort of, I think most of us are fairly overwhelmed by the idea that we have just made such a hash of it that it is irrecoverable. The really encouraging thing is that land actually recovers very quickly. Like within generations, you'll see a dramatic difference. Now, it doesn't mean that every plant that was originally there will necessarily regenerate or be able to be relocated there, or that the seed bank is still in the soil to sort of come back. But it does mean a significant number of those plants will, and the insects that rely on them will then return, and the birds that feed on those insects will then return, and the animals that sort of work. So all of a sudden you're building the complexity in the ecosystem that gives you the fertility you need. We're trying to sort of work with farmers that are against the idea of simplifying systems. And you know, I mean, to us, it's really self-evident that when you do simplify systems, because we're so ignorant about those systems, and when the bits that we extract from them that we think are valuable, we have no idea what we're leaving behind.
Yeah.
And the cost of that is immense. And you know, anyone who, just before the fires last summer, we experienced the dust storms that blew over Sydney. That's topsoil being lost from Western New South Wales. And when we have so little of it, now, obviously after 3 years of drought, even the best farmers were struggling to maintain ground cover. But there is a photo in the book, and if you've got the book right there, you might even be able to hold this photo up. Thank you, courtesy of Rob Lennon at Gundooey.
Right.
I'm not going to see that.
Do you remember what
Okay.
page it is? I'll find it.
Anyway,
Don't worry about it, Charlotte. We'll move on.
anyway, so what it shows you...
I am going to show you the fish photo, though.
Oh, good.
So let's just
So let's return to that.
Yeah.
I just wanted to sort of try and sort of place Vince's farm in a context of regeneration that had happened since he's been managing that farm.
Yeah.
So effectively, the
amazing,
5 generations where the fertility had been extracted, had essentially been mined of its fertility over a long period of time. And he was faced with, the sort of probably fairly unpleasant, realization that if he was going to farm it successfully, that he probably had to change dramatically.
I found the picture.
Well, yeah. I mean, if people can see that, they can see that's the border between 2 farms. One has managed to maintain ground cover even in the deepest part of the drought. And although a lot of that standing grass is near dead, it's still performing a really vital function. It's providing habitat, it's collecting dew, which drops, the dew runs down the stem. So what water can be collected will be collected in that environment. The one on the right-hand side of that photo, their recovery period will be infinitely longer. And they've just got a bit of extra feed into their cattle, but,
then they're drought-stricken for much longer, right?
Well, the recovery period then becomes much longer because, yeah, exactly. And so once you lose structure and you lose, permeability in the soil and you lose air and light, which soil is mainly an aerobic process of decay.
And then when it does rain, it can just wash off, right?
Skates off the surface because it's so compacted, the soil. The soil isn't spongy and full of air, and so it can't absorb the water.
Okay.
I think it's really interesting, though, just quickly, because what that photograph is basically saying is that there's somebody on one side who's looking to the long term, who has a long-term vision of life. And there's someone on the other side that has a short-term vision of life. And I think the thing that we've learned so clearly over the last, 10, 15 years is what we've seen time and time again with these farmers is how powerful and how transformative this long-term vision can be. And it's really exciting, and it fills you with optimism when you see it at work, because actually it's an attitude and a belief system that all of us can be party to. So you don't just have to be a farmer, you can be a consumer and buy into that too. And I think that's really what we all have to switch our perspective and think, all of us. So the questions that people ask us, for example, like, oh, well, meat's too expensive, or, well,
let's talk about that, because that does...
I shouldn't have said that. Are we going to talk about
No,
so well, the pigmy perch, but it is...
Oh, yeah, the pygmy perch.
I will tell you about the pygmy perch. These guys are...
It's in the book.
It's in the book, but it is... Vince Heffernan has created a wildlife sanctuary for the endangered pygmy perch, and it fenced off an area of their land that is purely for the purpose of protecting this endangered species.
And it's
not going to get that on a massive corporate farm. They're just never going to.
You won't get that on any farm, I don't reckon.
Well, that's the problem. I mean, Yes, the Lachlan River used to be, the Upper Lachlan was called the Fish River before it was renamed the Lachlan after, and now what used to be the home to thousands of native fish is now, unfortunately, in a state of disrepair that's not irrecoverable, but it will be hard to get back to its pristine state. But certainly,
Charlotte wants to interrupt us.
Good.
Now, well, I'm going to move us on because
I know, sorry.
this stuff is so interesting. We could really talk about each of these things for 3 hours, but let's move on. I'm going to skip over biodiversity and the whole issue with the fact that we only eat one type of chicken and all the problems associated with that. But let's move on to the animal welfare, because I think a lot of people like me who want to keep eating meat but feel they can't justify it ethically or environmentally, but also ethically about the treatment of the animals, come to you for that reason. So now people like you and Joel Salatin, the amazing American farmer, say that these animals have a fantastic life and then they have one bad day, right? So how can we cognitively align the concept of caring for animals, loving animals, wanting the very best for them, with killing them and eating them? How, isn't that just sort of one great big fat bit of denial that we're all engaged in? How do you respond to that question?
Well, they're bred for that purpose. They're bred for that exact purpose. So you probably wouldn't embark on that enterprise if you were not going to sell them. Having said that, a lot of these animals play a really crucial role in the landscape in terms of cycling nutrients, and they do that very, very efficiently and very well. Our dog is just going absolutely crazy.
That was one of your children.
Yeah.
Same.
So we believe that you can eat meat if you're prepared to confront the realities of how it's grown, how it's managed, how it dies, and be really clear about that. And not everybody, having all that information, is going to arrive at the same conclusion. And they might say, yes, I get all that, and I understand that they're part of a fertile sort of growth system. I understand that they're looked after well, but still, I choose not to eat meat. And that is a completely reasonable sort of conclusion to draw. However, you do have to then say, of the food I choose to eat, acknowledge what footprint it has. There is nothing that is grown in this world that you eat that has no consequence. You're stitched into it whether you like it or not. So
if you're thoughtlessly eating lots of tofu and thinking you're off the hook,
it's a fallacy.
Well, that's right. You're not off the hook, because widespread soybean cultivation has a lot to answer for in terms of loss of biodiversity, and a lot of other insects and animals sort of suffer as a result of that. I mean, it's obviously different because it is not the systematized raising and killing of animals for food. We believe that you can do it. I mean, in the end, it becomes a value judgment, whether you think that that's something that you can accommodate. We believe you can, providing you're sort of as honest about how that animal was raised and killed as you can be.
And so what are the elements of a good life for an animal? So we've accepted that we are going to eat animals, you and me and whoever else is eating animals. So given that, then what are your benchmarks for the animals that you sell for food? What are the elements of a good life for those animals?
So we have a set of principles which govern our practice, and they were established. Grant started working on those from the outset, and actually we've barely changed them in the time since then. And so there are a couple of cornerstone, I guess, principles that direct our practice, and they are fundamentally around allowing an animal the greatest capacity to express instinctive behaviour and its genetic potential. So the environment within which it's being husbanded, if that's the word, needs to be one which gives it the greatest freedom that's possible within the context of what we've just described as a, an agricultural system where this animal is being raised for a specific purpose. So all the animals that we sell are raised to the greatest possible degree outside in lots of space.
What are some of examples of those behaviours, say for a chicken or a pig?
Well, for a chicken, for example, I don't know, I bet you some of the people who are joining this conversation tonight have backyard chickens, and anyone who's had a backyard chicken or who's been involved in a co-op that has chickens or a local community garden that has chickens, you know how chickens behave. They have dust baths and they lie out in the sun and they scratch and they carry on and they come up and talk to you, and they're very sociable, really. Now, if you raise those animals inside a shed with very little space for them to move around, you're not giving them the opportunity to behave in ways that are instinctive. However, and this is where diversity comes in, and you mentioned it before, if you have bred an animal which is relatively docile, all the foraging instinct has been bred out of that animal, and it doesn't have the urge to do all, or not to the same degree of all these things, then you don't have the same problem, which is it's sort of a Frankenstein approach to things. I guess what we do is we seek out relationships with farmers who are choosing to raise animals with so-called heritage genetics, so that they are slow growing. They know how to, they are still possessed of the knowledge which allows them to know how to function in a...
The dog is expressing his animal instinct very happily.
You want me to get rid of it? I'm hearing.
It's hilarious. It's like, see, these people live this life. Shut up.
Pigs especially are incredibly social animals, and so I can see a Peter Ross from everyone, but battery hens, what did that say?
Well, we're going to come to those questions in a minute.
Hello, Peter.
So I don't know if we answered your question, did we? I mean, you were talking about humane conditions for animals. So it's about outside on pasture. It's about being given the sorts of foods, access to the kinds of foods which give them the greatest capacity to be healthy and self-medicate, because that's what animals do given the opportunity. And in fact, that's what humans do, as we know, given the opportunity as well. We eat different things at different times on different days because our bodies tell us we need those things. So if you give an animal a ration, which is a prescribed ration, which somebody somewhere, some vet somewhere has said, well, this is the optimum, a balance of nutrients and minerals and proteins and so on that an average animal needs. We all know we don't eat the same thing every day. Our bodies don't tell us we need that. So, we're interested in systems where basically the principle is you get out of the way of nature, because nature, given the opportunity, will self-organise in a much more effective and productive way than we can possibly do it, which goes back to Vince Heffernan, because Vince Heffernan paraphrases other people. It's not necessarily his idea, but this idea that we are not the centre of the universe, this egocentric sort of, top predator approach to life, which says that I will command everything, the entire natural world. It's proving to be an erroneous assumption about how you negotiate the world. And so an ecocentric approach is one which is a much more, intelligent response to the situation we find ourselves in.
I just left this book, Eat Like the Animals, up behind me, which is another book. It's by some scientists, friends of mine, and they're basically on about the same thing, but from a human health perspective.
Yeah, it's
the mixture, the complexity of what is occurring in nature, we ignore it at our peril.
That's right.
Now, there's lots of commentary. I'm interested in getting some questions, and I'm going to go to them in just a minute. But one thing I want to ask you, if we can answer this fairly quickly, is you guys have always talked very proudly about selling getting whole animals and selling whole animals, and I for a long time didn't really see what the big deal was about that. So tell me about why. Well, first, what is boxed meat, and why is it a problem? What's so great about having whole animals as opposed to boxed meat?
Well, obviously you can box meat that have been whole animals, but from our point of view, what it allows us to do is to negotiate and have a direct exchange with the farmer. Very few farmers can manage the process of boxing their meat and selling you bits of it. A few can, who have maybe an on-farm abattoir and small butchering room, or they might be a large farm and they have that sort of available to them. So there are exceptions to that. But from our point of view, being able to negotiate directly with the producer and know exactly what we're buying is, one, it's a guarantee for our consumer, but also it's a guarantee for us. And it's a much more direct relationship and a much more rewarding one. It changes. I mean, these are seasonally produced animals, especially because we're not doing shed raised animals. There's a lot of variation in that. So, and we saw it through the drought. It got much harder, and the condition of the carcasses, was less than perfect. But the best farmers still managed to send us, high quality meat, and that's a testament to how well they farm.
And I would like to say that's one of the things that I also, as a customer, have absorbed from you, is that when you're dealing with natural systems, you're dealing with the vagaries of that natural system. So if I want chicken thigh fillets, at a certain time, and it's, exactly the same and all of that, something might happen in the natural system that makes them not available. And I think we've been so trained to go, well, that's outrageous, that's terrible customer service.
I want it on tap.
Yeah, and I want consistency, this obsession with consistency. But what I've learned from you is that, well, okay, that's not available because it's from this amazing natural system.
It's something to be celebrated.
Exactly. So then I go, okay, well, I won't cook for those chicken thigh fillets. I'll cook something else. So we are starting. I don't want to take up too much time when people are also asking questions.
All right. Yep.
Let's go to Kate Mildenhall. Wonderful Kate in Melbourne in lockdown.
Okay, sorry you're in lockdown.
She's loving the book already. Is it better to find somewhere local who does what you do, or to speak to our local butcher about what they are doing and putting pressure on them to do better meat? Great question.
Great question.
And the answer is absolutely yes. So hopefully, more than anything, we hope people who either don't shop with us directly, or only sometimes, or they live where they can't shop with us, will use this as a way of giving them the tools that they can take to their local seller. And it might be a butcher, but it could equally be their fruit and vegetable seller, and it should be. And it could be the shop where they buy their bulk grains. Where was this rice grown? On what basis was this rice grown?
Now this is great, but it's also really, it can be quite confronting, right, as a consumer. Yeah. And I have a story. A friend of mine went talking about sustainable fishing and said to her fishmonger, where is this salmon from? And he looked at her and he said, the sea. And these questions are not welcome by everyone. And so Kate had another part of that question, which is, does she try and find the you, maybe the Tammy Jonas of Victoria, or does she do both? Maybe.
I think she does both. I think it's such a great question. It's so interesting and it's so difficult because, if we don't all actively engage in trying to promote change, in pressuring the butcher that isn't doing the thing that you want them to be doing, then the butcher's not going to learn, and you don't break the cycle. We all have a role to play, and consumers are the most powerful of all. Every time you spend $1, you are voting for a system one way or another, and you'd prefer that it would be a system that you support and that aligns with your ethical, values. So I think that we can't let ourselves off the hook. All of us, whatever it is that we're buying, we need to be very gently encouraging people to, butchers in this case, I suppose, to learn more. But I would also suggest that Kate should find somebody as close to what we do as possible, because all those people need support, because it's difficult to do what we do. And that, I'm not trying to,
And nobody's getting massively rich out of this, right? I mean, that's what...
No, none at all, not at all.
The farmers that you're dealing with are not rolling in cash as a result of their...
That's right.
So
support them.
Well, that's the other side of the answer to which is what I didn't quite finish about the whole animals, is that the commodity market completely distorts value.
Yeah.
And it's box meat, which is sort of comes in the commodity market. So the issue there is that, you know, they would say, oh, it sorts it out because people get what they want. That's actually not the case. It's totally set up for to suit the processors.
Yeah.
They want them all at a certain size. They want the uniformity. They want, you know, they actually don't reward quality at all. And they've got one parameter of value, and that is weight. And when you reduce, when your estimation of value is as unnuanced as that, you are going to immediately disqualify a whole range of things that need to be considered, which is why you don't get farmers have very little incentive, unless they're self-driven, to sort of manage their animals in a different way, which might have better environmental outcomes and might have more, you know, better welfare outcomes. All of those things are pocketed together, but you can't get that if you're in a commodity market. That's because it's not interested in those things.
Yeah.
And you're also, it's another whole area that we probably don't have time to get into, but, you know, policy-wise, farmers are rewarded in terms of drought, you know, subsidies for not doing this stuff.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
They're rewarded for old, out-of-date practices.
Yeah.
The questions are really coming in. I want to go to Therese Hall has a question. Is it possible for regenerative meat farming to match consumer demand?
Oh yes, the old one of it. Organic farming can't feed the world.
Yes, I would say, yeah, go on. But my thing is that we have to change the way we think about it.
Exactly.
And it was touching on what you said before, is that, well, I wanted chicken thighs. I had a recipe that I wanted to cook.
Yeah.
I needed 700 grams of chicken thighs. That idea of constant abundance is a really damaging notion. And I'm not a supermarket basher, because I don't think it's very helpful, because I think a huge amount of people engage with supermarkets for their food. So you need to work with that system to some extent, even though we operate it completely outside it. The lie about it is that abundance comes with no cost.
Yes.
And it comes with an enormous cost, and it is an illusion that it's constantly available. It actually, that the parallel of that is the way farmers manage farms with lower stocking densities. They're moving cattle around, for instance, around a farm and giving rest to areas all the time. It's that interval which provides life. It's that interval which provides order and meaning. And when something is available all the time, it has no meaning whatsoever. It's actually drained of meaning. There's no sense of feast when you can always eat duck. You know?
And I think that the pandemic has actually started to teach us that, if we're willing to listen. And that goes to a question from Robin Campbell. What do you think the current pandemic will do to the momentum of the ethical eating movement globally? She says, it seems the current default response to depleted soils and shrinking arable land globally before the pandemic was to look to science and AI for solutions. And that's a good thing to bring up. It seems we'd rather modify crops or grow meat in a lab and design robots to apply pesticide than to rehabilitate soil.
Good question.
Easy one.
Very good question. Yeah. I mean, the technological fix is it's so easy to grab that and think this will solve everything, as though we can sort of continue to turn our back on the thing that gives us life. We are all here, whether we like it or not, on the good grace of the planet we're on, you know, and it's systems. We cannot survive outside of those systems. We simply can't. We pretend that we can. And so the technological fix is just not going to work. That's for me, but I can see why people still believe that it can. I sort of thought by now they would have been challenged a bit, but
yeah, the denial of our relationship with nature, which has got us the pandemic, you know, is anyway. I'll shut up and let you guys talk. But so more questions. Joe DiPietro.
Deserve much longer answers.
I know they do. We really need about 6 hours for this. Maybe we should do another thing sometime. Anyway, Joe says, I like the idea of eating older meat. Will this become more available?
Well, it will become more available, but again, you know, so often all of these questions lead to the same answers, which is that our behaviour needs to change so that if consumer demand changes, then that impacts on the market. So one of the reasons why there are less older animals available is because it costs too much to keep them on the land, and the market doesn't return value for them. In fact, if you're looking at beef, for example, the market actively discourages farmers from keeping cattle on the land for longer, because the older an animal is, the less it's worth in the commodity market. So in fact, an older animal is worth less, which is really bizarre, because anybody who's eaten mature, you know, in our case, pasture-raised beef, I suppose, but a mature animal knows that the flavour profile is profoundly different. And, you know, it's again, I think it comes back to what we were talking about before, this idea of long-term vision and short-term vision. All you care about is an immediate return, and your understanding of value is as one-dimensional as it currently is, as Grant was referring to, then, you know, you don't end up with the sorts of options like that. I mean, there's a sort of a boutique movement around old dairy cows and older cows and so on, but it's absolutely minute. And you know, I mean, the animals that the farmers grow, who we work with, are largely genetics which are slow growing genetics, so they are by definition older. And you get all sorts of advantages and benefits, not just for the animal and the product that it produces, but also for the system in which it lives. So I think it's something that is really important and valuable, and traditionally was definitely something that happened. But these days, there's no market incentive.
We also need to know how to cook these things, right?
Well,
There's
right.
another whole, we've been de-skilled in so many areas.
That's it.
Kate Campbell says, are other farmers, like conventional farmers, learning from regenerative farmers and starting to adopt regenerative practices?
I think that's happening more and more. That's what we hear. And yet, for the last 15 years, and it's not stopping now as far as we can see, every time we go to visit the farmers we work with, we are astonished all over again by how the surrounding farming are so patently differently managed. You know, they look completely different. And it's always really, really surprising. You sort of think, but this is the next door neighbour. Why aren't they learning? Why aren't they seeing the advantages? But, you know, habits are very hard to break, and cultural, you know, norms are very difficult to shake off, particularly in rural communities.
Well, that brings me very nicely to a question that I had, sort of heading back to, I know there are more questions, we just can't get to them all, but to kind of wrap up, I want to ask another one. I'm sorry, everybody. That is about your creative lives and what they have brought to this life that you have now. And, you know, creativity has always been a huge part of what you do. You have art for sale in your butchery. I have,
Yes,
I won't show. Oh, my skull is over there. Oh, no, I can't. I'll unplug everything. But a beautiful painted skull. But the connection between creativity and food and your kind of beautifully optimistic, energetic approach to educating us about this stuff. One thing I wondered that maybe you had learned as being in the arts world is about being outsiders, because you have clearly been sort of outsiders for some time. I'm sure that many of your farmers in their local communities are seen as outsiders. How important is it to be able to tolerate being an outsider? Because that is hard, but this is what artists do. So I'm just suddenly wrapping it all back together.
For me, food is the perfect vehicle to be able to talk about art, talk about politics, talk about equity. There is nothing that doesn't branch from food, because it is central to people's lives. And because it has that central sort of place in people's lives, you know, ritual, art, everything has built up around it, and family, community is built up around it. So, you know, practice and ritual is part of that. So it's what we're looking at is the atomization of the way we eat, and that breaking up of community around food is a real symptom of what's happening on a much broader scale. And we would say the metaphor is what's happening under the ground. That loss of community, microbial community, is being represented very directly above the ground, both in the farming communities which grow our food, but also in the people that consume them. You know, when fully a third of the people in America are eating meals in their car, you know that you have lost an enormous opportunity of exchange. So it's a roundabout way of saying that food allows you to have that sort of conversation, but it also allows you to celebrate art and creativity, because really there's, you know, cooking for people is really one of the most creative and rewarding things that I know anyway. And I love that. I love that the enjoyment that people bring from it. That's sort of what I got from my mother, and also from working in restaurants.
And what about this willingness to kind of buck the system? Laura, maybe you can answer that.
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? You know, I think in our case, I used to liken us and what we do in our world now to, it's a little bit like, you know, being a creative person in a place like Australia. We're not constrained by the sorts of rules and mores and customs and traditions that artists in Europe, for example, have. So I think, you know, we sort of bold into this world in the way that you do when you don't really know any better. You're like a child. You sort of go, oh yeah, that's great. Let's do that. That's fantastic. Oh wow, listen to that story. Isn't that extraordinary? Isn't that just inspiring, that thing over there? And you just bowl through. And because you don't know that you can't, and you don't know that you shouldn't. And so, I mean, people like us aren't supposed to do what we do, I suppose, but because we knew no better, and because we were excited and inspired, we just sort of rolled on in. And it took us a while to sort of work out, oh, actually, we don't really have the credentials to be doing this. Should we really be doing this?
But form has followed function in this case.
Well, that's right.
So once you've decided on the form, that, you know, how the business would be, what it would focus on, then we've tried the shape of the business has conformed to that.
But for me personally, I think I would say that in terms of the creative expression,
passion, yes,
it's for me, it is deeply political. I mean, it's, you know, for me, you know, eating is a political act, and it took me a long time. I didn't understand that about food for a long time. I was like a lot of people who are, I suppose, you know, middle-class educated people who are a little bit dismissive of food. I didn't really get what food could be and what it represented. And when I got it, when the penny dropped for me, it was really powerful. And so I guess I took to it with a vengeance. You know, it was something that I'd really been looking for and needing, and it was a perfect vehicle for so many of the things that I wanted to say and do. But the other thing is the stories that we deal with. We deal with the most extraordinary people who have remarkable stories, and it's impossible not to be inspired and stimulated by that. And so, you know, my job is to tell those stories, and gives me great pleasure and great joy to do that. I think it's the stories that should be told.
I know we're right at the end, but I want to ask you one thing. If you could each name one thing that you have learned from the farmers you work with that has changed your life.
I'm going to go first, then I don't have to.
Good.
Well, it's really simple, and it sounds really wet and sort of obvious and banal. And I don't know how, I struggle to know how to say it in any other way. But I have learned that everything is connected, and I didn't know that before. I didn't understand that before, and I have learned that. I am in the process of learning that, and it changes everything. It makes you humble. It's I don't know where that goes, but I know that it will continue to change me, and so that's been really powerful for me.
That's beautiful, beautiful. Truly. Grant, what about you?
Well, a similar sort of thing, but more the extraordinary capacity, creative capacity of both people, animals, and land to produce really positive things. And when they're harnessed in the right way, you know, to me, it's like a good farmer is sort of like an orchestrator. And witnessing really sort of thoughtful humble and responsive orchestration is absolutely wonderful. And that's what you see in the best farmers, but you also see that, I mean, in every sphere. They're the sort of preconditions. We sort of, you know, I see farmers as artists. The best farmers are artists in that they're interpreting the landscape and responding to it and the animals in it all the time. And that's a very, you know, that's a response that many people have to the natural world. They're shaping it for obviously for a particular outcome, and people might see that quite cynically, and certainly it can be practiced cynically. I would like to think that the farmers that we work with don't.
No, they clearly don't.
Have a clear sort of vision about what they're trying to achieve.
Look, there is, we have to finish, unfortunately, but...
just like winemakers, yes.
I did. And Peter Ross has been making fantastic comments, and I haven't been able to go to them, but
well, yes.
You can hear, people who haven't yet read the book can just hear how inspiring these people are, the farmers, Grant and Laura. I feel really moved by this book. And it's also got really great recipes. But it's a powerful kind of call to action for all of us, but in a way that is beautiful and creative and fun and pleasurable and all about this connection and interconnection. And I just think it should be celebrated. So congratulations.
Thank you so much, Charlotte.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you everybody for coming, and I'll just reiterate that if anyone's missed out, there will be a recording available. You can email us at books@betterred.com.au, or you can call us tomorrow and we can send you a Dropbox link. But thank you everybody for supporting Better Red Than Dead and these two amazing creators in front of you.
Thanks, Emma.
Thank you.
All right, have a good night everybody.
Bye. Thank
Bye.
you.